Before the sun had lifted its rim above the Philippine horizon, on the morning of 25th of October, 1944, the waters east of the island of Samar lay under a pale and shifting veil. The air was heavy with the damp heat of the tropics, yet a faint breeze ran over the steel decks of the escort carriers of Task Unit 77.4.3, the unit the sailors knew simply as Taffy 3. On the flag bridge of the USS Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague stood with his binoculars raised, peering into the dim light. The previous day had been uneventful. That morning promised little more than the usual combat air patrols and anti-submarine sweeps in support of the landings at Leyte Gulf. Out here, the enemy was assumed to be distant, bottled up, harried by submarines, or occupied with the main fleet actions elsewhere. In truth, just beyond the curvature of the Earth to the northwest, a storm of steel and fire was bearing down upon them. At the head of that storm was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The most powerful surface force Japan had yet committed to the defense of the Philippines. Its spear point was Yamato herself, the largest battleship ever built, her 18.1-inch guns capable of tearing an escort carrier in two with a single salvo. The others, Nagato, Kongo, Haruna, and a host of heavy cruisers like Chokai and Chikuma, formed a wall of armor, speed, and firepower unimaginable to the Americans manning the lightly built jeep carriers of Taffy 3. At 0546, the world still lay in a gray half-light. On the decks of the small carriers, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Kitkan Bay, and Gambier Bay, the morning routine unfolded with quiet precision. Sailors moved between the island structures and the catwalks, checking safety pins on ordnance, fueling FM-2 Wildcat fighters, and readying TBM Avenger torpedo bombers for their daily missions. In the ready rooms, pilots in khaki flight suits and Mae West life vests drank from steaming mugs, listening to the droning weather brief and the day's sortie assignments. The FM-2s, the latest and last variant of the Wildcat line, were rugged, stubby-winged defenders, slower than the sleek F-6F Hellcat, but nimble at low altitudes and tough enough to bring their pilots home after absorbing punishment. The Avengers, big 3-man torpedo bombers, were the workhorses for anti-shipping strikes and patrol. Their mission this day, so they believed, would be routine: fly west toward Leyte, guard the invasion fleet, and watch for any stray submarines or small craft that might threaten the landings. Yet far to the northwest, as dawn crept across the Sibuyan Sea, Kurita's fleet was steaming at high speed through San Bernardino Strait. Only the day before, they had endured a pounding from U.S. carrier aircraft in those confined waters, losing the massive battleship Musashi and suffering heavy damage to several cruisers. American commanders had assumed this was enough to turn the center force back. But Kurita, after temporarily reversing course, had regrouped and now pressed on toward Leyte Gulf with undiminished resolve. His orders under Operation Shogo 1 were clear: break into Leyte Gulf, smash the invasion fleet, and annihilate the U.S. transports and their escorts. With the northern force, a decoy carrier group under Admiral Ozawa, drawing Admiral William F. Halsey's Third Fleet far to the north, there was nothing in position between Kurita and the vulnerable American invasion anchorage except the 3 escort carrier units known as Taffy 1, 2, and 3. By sheer chance of geography and patrol rotation, Taffy 3 lay directly in his path. At 0637, lookouts on the destroyer USS Johnston, stationed to the north of the formation, reported distant shapes on the horizon. At first, they seemed like low islands in the morning haze. Then the specks grew, masts and superstructures resolving in the strengthening light. The shapes multiplied, more than a dozen of them, and the glitter of glass and steel atop the masts betrayed optics and fire control gear. The alarm ran through the radio net with startling urgency. Enemy fleet in sight, bearing 015, range approximately 17 miles. For the men aboard Taffy 3, the words seemed almost unreal. The Japanese battle line had not been expected here. The fleet commanders had believed Kurita's force was still retreating, or at worst, contained. But now, here they were, close enough to bring their massive guns to bear within minutes. Sprague's options were few. The escort carriers could barely make 17 knots at flank speed. The Japanese heavy units could make over 25. They could not outrun them. They could not match their firepower. The only choice was to turn east, lay down smoke, and fight a delaying action with every aircraft, ship, and weapon at hand. Aboard the carriers, klaxons wailed. Pilots ran from the ready rooms to their planes, mechanics tearing away chocks as engines coughed and roared to life. There was no time to load proper anti-ship torpedoes or full bomb loads. Aircraft were sent aloft with whatever they had: 500-pound general-purpose bombs, depth charges meant for submarines, or even just full belts of 50-caliber ammunition. On the fans of rising exhaust fumes, FM-2 Wildcats began clawing into the sky. Their short takeoff runs a testament to the narrow decks and urgent hands that launched them. The first to lift clear of the decks banked toward the looming enemy column, sunlight glinting off canopies still smeared with salt spray from the humid air. For the Japanese sailors aboard the leading ships, the scene ahead was equally unexpected. They had anticipated intercepting a major American carrier group, perhaps even Essex-class fleet carriers with full fighter screens. Instead, they saw what appeared to be a ragtag line of smaller flat tops, their decks crowded with stubby fighters and plodding bombers. It should have been, by every measure of naval power, an easy engagement. Yet the first American aircraft diving toward their ships showed no sign of hesitation. Wildcats stitched the decks of the heavy cruiser Kumano with tracers, forcing gunners to duck and disrupting the initial ranging shots from her main battery. Avengers dropped bombs on the nearest destroyers, forcing them to scatter and weave, breaking up the perfect battle line the Japanese commanders had hoped to maintain. Kurita's flagship, Yamato, steadied for her opening salvo. Her forward 18.1-inch turret swung toward the eastern horizon, elevation set for a ranging shot at over 20,000 yards. The concussion of the first guns shook the bridge windows. 3 shells, each weighing over 3,200 pounds, arced into the sky, trailing their own shadows. They fell short, geysers of water erupting near the fleeing American carriers. The Japanese gunners adjusted and fired again, this time bracketing their targets. On the American bridges, officers could see the towering white plumes of shell splashes, each one large enough to engulf a destroyer. Yet still the Wildcats came in, low and fast, weaving between streams of anti-aircraft fire. It was at this moment, in the opening minutes of what would be remembered as the battle off Samar, that the disparity between attacker and defender crystallized in every participant's mind. On paper, the Americans were outmatched in every category: speed, armor, gunpowder, and weight of numbers. But the U.S. Navy's small escort carrier group carried something the Japanese did not anticipate: a will to fight with every ounce of aggression, to turn every available aircraft into a weapon, and to close with the enemy regardless of cost. The FM-2 Wildcat, Outclassed in many arenas by Japan's premier fighter, the A6M0 was in this setting an ideal tool. Simple, tough, and deadly at the altitudes and speeds of the day's battle. Its pilots were about to turn that advantage into a defensive wall in the sky. The stakes for both sides were enormous. For the Americans, losing Taffy 3 would open the path to the unprotected invasion fleet at Leyte, potentially dooming the landings and inflicting catastrophic losses. For the Japanese, success here offered their last realistic chance to deliver a decisive blow in the Pacific, perhaps buying the empire the time it desperately needed to fortify its remaining holdings. Neither side knew it in that instant, but the clash unfolding would become one of the most extraordinary mismatches in naval history, a contest in which determination, improvisation, and sheer audacity would outweigh the cold mathematics of naval gunnery tables. And it was beginning now, in the pale gold light of a Philippine morning, with Wildcats climbing to meet the oncoming storm. To understand why a small escort carrier group found itself face-to-face with the most powerful surface fleet Japan had left, we must step back from the waters off Samar and trace the larger pattern of moves that brought both sides to this collision. The battle off Samar was not a random encounter. It was one act in the vast and complex drama of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought between 23 and 26 of October 1944, the largest naval engagement in history, involving nearly 300 ships across 4 distinct but interconnected actions. Leyte was more than a battlefield. It was the pivot point of the Pacific War. The American landings there aimed to sever Japan's southern lifeline, the sea routes from the resource-rich territories of the Netherlands, East Indies, and Malaya that fed the empire's war machine with oil, rubber, and minerals. Cut off from those supplies, Japan's ability to continue the war on any large scale would collapse within months. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters had known for months that an American move on the Philippines was inevitable. By mid-1944, the U.S. had seized the Marianas, bringing B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The loss of the Philippines would be catastrophic, effectively splitting Japan's empire in two. The counterstroke conceived to prevent this was Operation Shogo 1, Victory Operation 1, a bold, multi-pronged plan to lure the U.S. Third Fleet away from the landing beaches, smash the invasion force, and annihilate the transports before they could unload their cargo of men, guns, and supplies. It was an ambitious design, born of desperation as much as of strategy. The Japanese Navy of late 1944 could no longer hope to match the United States ship for ship or plane for plane. Their best chance lay in creating a local superiority through surprise and concentration, even at the cost of sacrificing much of their remaining strength. The plan's core relied on deception. To the north, a decoy force, the Northern Force under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, would steam south from the waters off Japan, built around 4 aircraft carriers, Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor strike force, accompanied by Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. These carriers carried only a fraction of their intended air groups, most of their planes having been lost in earlier battles, but they retained the ability to appear threatening on American radar screens and scouting reports. Their mission was not to fight a decisive carrier battle, but to lure Admiral William Bull Halsey and his powerful Third Fleet northward, away from Leyte Gulf. Meanwhile, the main blow would come from the west. Vice Admiral Kurita's Center Force, the most heavily armed surface group the Imperial Navy could still assemble, would approach through the Sibuyan Sea and the narrow San Bernardino Strait, emerging on the eastern side of the Philippines to fall upon the vulnerable escort carriers and transports supporting the landings. From the south, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's Southern Force, with its own battleships and cruisers, would push up through Surigao Strait, linking with Kurita's armada inside Leyte Gulf to complete the encirclement. If the plan worked, American amphibious forces would find themselves trapped between two hammer blows, without the shield of Halsey's fast carriers and battleships. For the Americans, the command structure in these waters reflected the complexity of the operation. Overall control rested with Admiral Chester W. Nimitz in Pearl Harbor, but in the Leyte sector itself, operational authority was split. Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid's 7th Fleet, under General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area Command, was tasked with direct support of the landings. This included the 3 groups of escort carriers, Taffy 1, 2, and 3, assigned to provide close air support and anti-submarine coverage. Halsey's 3rd Fleet, with the fast carriers and battleships, operated in the broader Pacific theater role, striking power to destroy Japanese fleet units wherever they were found. Coordination between these forces was good on paper, but, as the events of Leyte Gulf would reveal, dangerously vulnerable to assumptions and incomplete communication. On 24 October, the day before Samar, these moving pieces began to collide. American reconnaissance aircraft spotted Kurita's center force in the Sibuyan Sea. That day saw repeated waves of carrier aircraft from Halsey's 3rd Fleet hammer the Japanese formation, sinking the battleship Musashi under a storm of bombs and torpedoes. The scale of the attack, and Kurita's brief withdrawal to the west, convinced Halsey that the threat was neutralized. Meanwhile, to the north, scouts reported the approach of Ozawa's carrier force. To Halsey, a commander aggressive by nature and convinced that carriers were the prime targets in naval war, the decoy worked as intended. Late on the 24th, Halsey gathered his carriers and fast battleships and steamed north at high speed to engage Ozawa, leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Kurita, battered but far from destroyed, resumed his advance. By the early hours of 25 October, his ships were sliding through the strait, their passage masked by night and the absence of American patrols. To the south, Nishimura's Southern Force was about to meet its doom at Surigao Strait, ambushed by Oldendorf's 7th Fleet battleships in a textbook crossing the T action. But Kurita knew nothing of that yet. His orders were unchanged: reach Leyte Gulf and attack. Thus, as dawn touched the waters east of Samar, the only American warships between Kurita and his objective were the 6 escort carriers and 7 small escorts of Taffy 3. Taffy 1 and Taffy 2 were positioned further south and east, close enough to hear the calls for help that would soon come, but too far to intervene in the opening hour. The vulnerability of the northernmost group had not seemed significant to higher command. The Japanese, it was thought, would never risk such a push after the beating they had taken in the Sibuyan Sea. This assumption would prove one of the most dangerous miscalculations of the Pacific War. For the men of Taffy 3, there had been no special warning the night before. Some had turned in early after long hours of flight operations. Others stayed on deck in the warm tropical night, smoking, talking quietly, watching the dim phosphorescence in the ship's wake. They did not know that somewhere beyond the horizon, the silhouettes of Yamato, Kongo, and Nagato were cutting through the black water, their wakes white in the moonlight. Nor did they imagine that within hours, their little formation would be fighting for its life against an enemy that outweighed and outgunned it by orders of magnitude. The strategic chessboard had been set, the pieces in motion, and now with the board unguarded in the north, the decisive move was about to fall upon them. Taffy 3 was, in every respect, a modest fighting force. Formed around 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, it was designed for the unglamorous but vital work of close support, ferrying aircraft for ground strikes, providing air patrols against submarines, and guarding the slow-moving transports that poured men and supplies into Leyte Gulf. These were not ships built to stand in the line of battle. The carriers themselves, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Kitcon Bay, and Gambier Bay, were converted merchant hulls, their thin skins of steel barely thick enough to stop machine gun fire, let alone the great shells of a battleship. They could make barely 17 knots at top speed, and their flight decks were just long enough to launch aircraft with the help of a stiff headwind and a pilot's nerve. Each carried a composite air group, usually a dozen or so FM-2 Wildcats for air defense, and 18 to 20 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers for strike and patrol work. The FM-2 was an updated version of the Wildcat that had fought in the desperate days of 1942. Smaller and lighter than the F-6F Hellcat, it retained an excellent rate of climb and rugged airframe, perfect for the short decks of the escort carriers. Its 450 caliber Browning machine guns could shred lightly armored aircraft and ground targets, but against steel warships it could do little without bombs or rockets. The Avengers, on the other hand, could deliver a potent punch, a Mark 13 aerial torpedo or a load of bombs, but they were slow and made large, easy targets. The 3 destroyers assigned to Taffy 3, USS Johnston, USS Howell, and USS Herman, were of the Fletcher class, fast, agile, and bristling with 5-inch guns and torpedo tubes. They were designed to scout, screen, and, if the opportunity arose, attack larger ships with a sudden torpedo strike. Even more lightly built were the 4 destroyer escorts, USS Samuel B. Roberts, USS Raymond, USS Dennis, and USS John C. Butler, smaller, slower, with only 2 5-inch guns and a single triple torpedo mount. They were intended to chase submarines, not duel with cruisers or battleships. Yet in the hours ahead, all of them would be called to perform far beyond their design. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, a career naval aviator, had assumed command of Taffy 3 in September 1944. He knew his mission, and he knew the limitations of his ships. As dawn brightened the sky that morning, he was on the bridge of Fanshawe Bay, scanning the eastern horizon where his planes were expected to operate. The air patrols for the day's work were being spotted and readied. At this point, there was no inkling of the storm gathering to the northwest. Communications with other units had not warned of any surface threat in the area. To the south, Taffy 1 and Taffy 2 were following similar routines. The destroyers steamed on the carrier's flanks, weaving slightly, their lookouts alert for submarines. On Gambier Bay, pilots lounged in the ready room, chatting quietly as they listened to the routine morning brief. The smell of strong coffee and cigarette smoke hung in the air, mingling with the faint tang of aviation fuel drifting in from the hangar deck. Men checked their sidearms, adjusted life vests, and pored over charts of the coastline around Leyte. In the maintenance bays below, crewmen in oil-stained dungarees tightened engine fittings, tested hydraulics, and topped off fuel tanks. On the destroyer Johnston, Commander Ernest E. Evans moved briskly along the bridge wing, conferring with his officers. Evans, part Cherokee and known for his aggressive style, had once told his crew that the Johnston would never turn away from a fight. That morning, The words would become a binding oath. The escort carrier formation itself was simple but disciplined. The carriers steamed in a loose arc, destroyers on the port bow and starboard beam, destroyer escorts screening the rear. The carriers' flight decks pointed into the light breeze, ready to launch. It was a pattern repeated countless times across the Pacific, unremarkable in appearance, but requiring constant vigilance to maintain in the open ocean. The FM-2 Wildcats of Taffy 3's composite squadrons had a hard-earned reputation among their pilots. Though they lacked the sheer speed of the Hellcat or Corsair, they could turn tightly, climb quickly, and take punishment that would crumple a lighter fighter. Many of the pilots had flown earlier versions in the Solomons or the Gilberts. They knew the machine's quirks and strengths. That morning, their role was expected to be modest: intercept any snooping Japanese reconnaissance planes, patrol for periscopes, and perhaps strafe a few enemy positions inland. None had been briefed to expect the massive surface fleet that was even now closing the range. When the first distant mast tops appeared to the northwest, it was a lookout aboard one of the destroyers who spotted them. The report was relayed instantly up the chain of command, but there was a moment of disbelief. Enemy ships here? At this hour? Confirmation came swiftly. The glint of morning light off optics and gun barrels, the high silhouettes of pagoda masts, and the sheer number of contacts. Admiral Sprague had only minutes to react. He ordered the carriers to turn east, toward Leyte Gulf, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the enemy. Smoke generators on the destroyers began to pump thick white clouds across the formation's wake. Over the TBS voice radio, Sprague's orders were clipped and urgent: launch all available aircraft immediately. In the ready rooms, the shift in tone was instant and electric. Pilots abandoned their coffee and cigarettes, grabbing helmets and goggles, jogging to the flight deck. Plane captains moved like men possessed, tearing away wheel chocks, swinging propellers to prime the engines. There was no time to load the ideal ordnance. Aircraft would take off with whatever they had: bombs intended for ground targets, depth charges for submarines, even fuel tanks half-filled to save precious seconds. Aboard the destroyers, captains were already adjusting course to interpose themselves between the carriers and the enemy. Gun crews loaded armor-piercing shells, not for use against aircraft, but against the armored skins of the cruisers now coming into sight. Torpedo tubes were checked and swung outboard. Men along the decks could see the enemy line forming, the towering bulk of battleships rising above the smaller escorts. In the hangars and on the decks of the carriers, ordnance crews heaved bombs into place under Avengers, securing them with practiced efficiency. The first FM-2s roared down the decks, lifting off into the morning air and banking hard toward the threat. Pilots felt the adrenaline surge as the tiny decks fell away beneath them, the ocean opening up, the rising sun glaring through their canopies. For Sprague, the situation was brutally clear. Taffy 3 was not designed to fight this battle. Its strength lay in the skill and courage of its pilots and the thin screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts willing to throw themselves against a vastly superior enemy. There would be no reinforcements in the opening minutes, only what they carried aboard and the determination of the men to use it. The thin shield of Taffy 3 was all that stood between Kurita's armada and the soft, slow-moving heart of the Leyte invasion fleet. The weight of that knowledge pressed upon every officer on every bridge, every pilot strapping into a cockpit, and every sailor bracing himself on a gun mount. The battle off Samar was about to begin in earnest, and the measure of these ships and men would be taken in the fire to come. The first FM-2 Wildcats clawed into the sky with engines straining, their stubby wings lifting them over the smoke veil that now hung low over Taffy 3's retreating formation. The pilots had no time for elaborate rendezvous or formation climbs. They went up singly or in twos, wingmen scattered, some barely clearing the decks before banking toward the oncoming Japanese fleet. Below them, the dark shapes of Kurita's battleships and cruisers were no longer distant smudges on the horizon. They were full silhouettes now, hulls cutting clean wakes in the morning sun, gun turrets already traversing toward the American ships. Lieutenant Commander Thomas L. McGraw, leading one of the first Wildcats off Fanshawe Bay, had been briefed only minutes earlier. The enemy force was enormous, their exact disposition unclear. He carried nothing more than his 450 caliber Brownings and a pair of 100 Ploblo general-purpose bombs, hardly ideal for attacking armored warships. But that was all the ordnance spotted and ready when the alarm came. His instructions were blunt. Harass, distract, inflict whatever damage possible, and keep their eyes off the carriers. As his Wildcat leveled out at 3,000 feet, the view ahead was staggering. A wall of ships advancing in perfect battle order, the massive Yamato leading one column, Kongo and Haruna looming to starboard, cruisers like Chokai and Suzuya flanking them in deadly symmetry. The Japanese gunners saw the Americans coming. Flashes winked along cruiser decks, and the first bursts of flak bloomed black and orange in the sky ahead. McGraw pushed the nose over, dropping into a shallow dive toward a heavy cruiser's bridge. He loosed both bombs in quick succession. One exploded in the water just off the bow, the other near the ship's after superstructure. Neither would cripple her, but the blast rattled crew and threw up walls of spray that drenched open gun positions. His wingman strafed the forward decks, cutting down anti-aircraft crews before pulling away low, barely above mast height. Elsewhere, Wildcats from White Plains and Kitcon Bay darted in on the flanks of the formation, their 50 caliber streams stitching lines across deck planking and unarmored sections. These were pinpricks against such massive opponents, but each pass forced Japanese crews to duck, delayed their firing solutions, and kept their attention fractured. The goal was never to destroy outright, but to buy minutes, each one precious to the carriers now pushing east at maximum speed. Following the Wildcats came the first TBM Avengers. Lumbering by comparison, they carried the heavier ordnance that could truly threaten a capital ship, 500 pounds of bombs, and in a few cases, the cumbersome Mark 13 torpedo. Lieutenant Harold Bubba Thomas from St. Lo led his three-plane section in at wave-top height, aiming for the port quarter of a cruiser straggling slightly behind its station. Japanese gunners raked the sea around them, water plumes slamming against fuselages. Thomas released at 900 yards. The torpedo struck the water cleanly, its telltale wake racing toward the target. Moments later, a column of spray and debris erupted against the cruiser's hull, sending her briefly out of line. The Avengers clawed away, one trailing smoke, another with holes in its tailplane. From Yamato's bridge, Vice Admiral Kurita watched the scene with tightening jaw. This was not the reception his lookouts had promised. He had expected the small American carriers to flee without effective resistance, perhaps throwing up a few token aircraft before being run down by his big guns. Instead, the sky seemed suddenly alive with darting enemy fighters, the sea dotted with the wakes of incoming torpedoes. His force pressed on, but the perfect symmetry of his battle line was beginning to fray under the constant need to evade and suppress these attackers. For the Americans, there was no rhythm yet, only constant improvisation. Pilots landed on whatever carrier was nearest after a run, refueled, rearmed with whatever the ordnance crews could throw under their wings, and launched again. Wildcats went up with rockets intended for ground targets. Avengers carried depth charges meant for submarines. Anything that could explode near a Japanese ship was fair game. This chaos worked in their favor. Japanese gunners could not settle into patterns. Every few minutes, a new flight appeared from a different quarter, forcing them to swing their mounts and re-aim. Commander Ernest Evans aboard USS Johnston was already charging into the fray with his destroyer, guns firing, but his aggression was mirrored in the air above. Wildcats from Kalinin Bay dove almost vertically onto a destroyer racing ahead of the main body, raking her decks and setting a forward mount ablaze. The ship veered sharply, momentarily blocking the line of fire from a following cruiser. Every such disruption eased the pressure on the carriers. One particularly audacious run came from Lieutenant Ralph "Doc" Daves, who spotted a formation of Japanese dive bombers, Aichi D-3A Vals, approaching low over the water, likely launched from nearby land bases in support of Kurita's thrust. Daves turned head-on into them, opening fire at extreme range. His first burst tore into the Ladval's engine, sending it cartwheeling into the sea. The others jinked and climbed, breaking formation under his relentless chase. Here, in the confused melee, the Wildcats' low-altitude agility showed its worth. Though slower than the Japanese Zero, the FM-2 could outturn it in a tight horizontal fight, and its rugged frame could absorb damage that would shred lighter planes. As the first half-hour of combat wore on, reports began filtering back over the radio net. Enemy ships hit, fires spotted, Japanese air attacks disrupted. The kill tally was still small, but each engagement bought more time. The Japanese timetable, to close the range and finish the American carriers quickly, was already slipping. Kurita's gunnery officers found their spotting aircraft driven off, their range-finding disrupted by smoke and sudden evasive maneuvers forced by the persistent American strikes. By 0730, the opening phase had cost both sides. Several Wildcats were downed or forced to ditch. At least one Avenger was seen to crash in flames after a bomb run. Yet the Japanese had not landed a decisive blow on the carriers. Gambier Bay, though already under long-range shell fire, still held her place in the retreating line. Sprague, hearing the pilot's clipped, breathless reports, understood that the only thing keeping Kurita's ships from overrunning his formation was the constant hammering in the air. Every aircraft that could fly would have to be thrown back into the fight, again and again, until relief came, or until none were left to launch. And so the first strikes of the battle off Samar closed with the same urgency with which they had begun. Wildcats darting in and out of flak, Avengers thundering low over the waves, and the great battleships of the Imperial Japanese Navy pressing forward into a fight they had not expected. In the minds of Japanese officers that morning, the script had been simple. Destroy the small carriers, push into Leyte Gulf, and achieve a long-awaited victory. But by now, the edges of that script were already beginning to tear. Even as the first waves of Wildcats and Avengers dove through flak and smoke to harass Kurita's warships, another kind of fury was gathering on the surface. The three Fletcher-class destroyers of Taffy 3, USS Johnston, USS Hoel, and USS Herman, had been screening the escort carriers only minutes earlier, weaving back and forth in their anti-submarine patrol lines. Now, with the enemy battle line closing fast and the range to the nearest Japanese cruisers dropping below 20,000 yards, they were ordered forward. Rear Admiral Sprague knew his carriers could not run far enough or fast enough to escape. The only way to buy time was to throw his destroyers directly into the path of the enemy, to charge, launch torpedoes, and force Kurita's massive ships to turn and scatter. On Johnston, Commander Ernest E. Evans didn't wait for formal orders. At 0724, even as Sprague was still issuing directives, Evans rang up full speed and turned his bow toward the enemy on his own initiative. Those on the bridge later recalled his words. "Commence torpedo attack. All ahead flank." The ship leapt forward, her bow wave foaming as her 5-inch guns began to speak. Evans had no illusions. His ship's 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns could not pierce the thick armor belts of a battleship. But they could rake superstructures, disable secondary batteries, and smash fire control stations. And if his torpedoes struck home, even Yamato herself would be forced to turn away. Johnston's charge was a lonely, defiant sprint into a wall of fire. The first salvos from the Japanese heavy cruisers straddled her, throwing up pillars of water on either side. Fragments clanged off her hull. One hit disabled her forward fire control radar, forcing the gunners to shift to optical sights. Still, she ran in, closing the range with Kumano, a cruiser on Yamato's port flank. At 10,000 yards, Evans ordered, "Stand by! Fire!" 10 Mark 15 torpedoes splashed into the sea, their wakes cutting straight toward the oncoming cruiser. Moments later, a tall column of water and smoke erupted against Kumano's bow. The torpedo blast tore away her forward turrets and severed her bow section. She swung hard out of line, bleeding speed, effectively out of the fight. The other 2 destroyers were not far behind. USS Hoel, under Commander Leon S. Kintberger, charged in from the carrier's port side, aiming for the battleships. Japanese shells bracketed her almost immediately. A direct hit on her forward 5-inch mount killed most of the crew inside. Another struck the bridge, wounding Kintberger and killing his talker. Yet Hoel pressed on, weaving to throw off the enemy's aim, launching torpedoes at Haruna. The Japanese battlecruiser was forced to turn away sharply to avoid the spread, a maneuver that disrupted the carefully timed gunnery of the ships behind her. USS Hirman, the last of the 3, found herself engaging Chikuma, a heavy cruiser attempting to flank the carriers from the east. Captain Amos Hathaway pushed Hirman in close, exchanging salvo for salvo at ranges so short the crews could see the flashes of the enemy's muzzle blast and the dark shapes of men running along her decks. Hirman launched her torpedoes at point-blank range, forcing Chikuma to sheer off and giving the American carriers a few more vital minutes. Above this desperate surface fight, Wildcats from the escort carriers slashed in low over the destroyers, strafing Japanese gun crews to suppress their fire and covering the torpedo runs. Pilots later described seeing Johnston disappear entirely behind towering waterspouts, only to emerge again, still firing, still charging. The coordination was almost instinctive, surface and air acting as one to throw every possible obstacle in Kurita's path. The Japanese gunnery officers were frustrated and increasingly alarmed. This was not the passive, defensive retreat they had anticipated from the Americans. Instead, they faced a swarm of attackers, destroyers darting in close, torpedo wakes crisscrossing their path, fighters buzzing low over the waves. Kurita's flagship Yamato was forced to alter course more than once to avoid incoming torpedoes, each turn disrupting her fire control solutions and those of the ships astern. The neat columns of the center force began to break apart, their momentum slowing. But the cost to the destroyers was severe. Johnston, hit by shells from multiple directions, began to lose speed. A 14-inch shell from Congo punched through her port side, flooding her forward engine room. Evans swung her around, limping back toward the carriers, but only to rearm and re-engage. Hoel took hit after hit until her forward motion ceased, She listed heavily, her decks awash. The order to abandon ship came as the Japanese fire found her magazines. She slipped beneath the waves just after 0830, her crew struggling in the oil-slicked sea. Even in these final moments for some, the destroyer's sacrifice was having the intended effect. Japanese rangefinders, repeatedly jarred off target by evasive maneuvers and constant interference from strafing Wildcats, were unable to score decisive hits on the carriers. Shells fell wide or short, splashing into the protective smoke the Americans kept between themselves and the enemy. At the height of the destroyer's charge, one Avenger pilot reported over the radio, "Those tin cans are charging like madmen." In the slang of the fleet, tin can was both a term of affection and a recognition of the destroyer's thin skin. It was almost beyond belief. To turn and run toward ships whose guns could blow them apart with a single direct hit. Yet that is what they did, over and over, until fuel, ammunition, or seaworthiness failed. For Kurita, the scene was becoming less a clean execution and more a chaotic brawl. His force was still far stronger, but the timetable, crucial to his plan to break into Leyte Gulf, was slipping further with each passing minute. By the time the last torpedoes from Heermann sped toward their targets, the carriers had widened the gap by several miles. Still under fire, still within range, but alive. The destroyer's charge had bought that life, and overhead, the Wildcats and Avengers were already arcing back in for another strike, determined to keep the giants off balance until either help came from the south or the battle consumed them all. Even as the tin cans of Taffy 3 were making their suicidal torpedo runs through walls of shell splashes, the sky above the retreating carriers became its own battlefield. The FM-2 Wildcats, those short-legged, rugged fighters originally intended for convoy escort and local defense, were now tasked with holding an aerial perimeter against any threat that could fall upon the fleeing formation, and they would do so with a ferocity that shocked the Japanese aviators who entered their airspace that morning. The conditions favored them in subtle ways. The low, humid air over Samar in late October tended to sap the performance of high-powered aircraft, but the FM-2's Wright R-1820 radial engine was reliable in such environments. Its smaller wingspan and lightened airframe made it quick off the deck and nimble in low-altitude fights, the kind most likely to develop around the carriers now that Kurita's surface guns had begun to range them. The Wildcats' armor protection for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks meant that many could take hits, limp back, rearm, and return to the fight in under 20 minutes. Shortly after 0800, the first enemy aircraft began appearing from the west. Not carrier-borne, but land-based bombers and dive bombers from airfields on Luzon and other nearby islands, coordinated to strike in support of Kurita's thrust. Spotters on Kitkun Bay saw the glint of sunlight on wings as the attackers came in low over the sea, using the horizon's haze as cover. The Wildcats pounced. Lieutenant J.G. Thomas A. Moore from VC-10, flying from Gambier Bay, led his section in a head-on pass against a group of Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers. The FM-2's 4 Brownings spat long streams of tracer, their convergence tearing through the lead bomber's engine cowling. The Judy cartwheeled into the sea, its wings snapping on impact. Moore's wingman swung wide to avoid a collision, only to roll in behind another bomber and cut it down in a 6-second burst. From the cockpit of a Mitsubishi A6M0 covering the bombers, Petty Officer First Class Saburo Saito later admitted in post-war interviews that the Americans' aggression surprised him. "We believed these were the small carriers' planes, old and weak," he recalled, "but they came at us without fear, even one against many." The Wildcats fought not in the grand, sweeping arcs of carrier fleet battles, but in tight, vicious circles and quick slashing passes. Their mission was not to hunt kills for glory, but to protect the slow, thin-skinned carriers below. That meant breaking up every attack run, scattering bomber formations before they could align for a dive or torpedo drop. At times, Wildcats would ignore enemy fighters entirely, plunging through their defensive screens to get at the strike aircraft. The kill tally began to climb almost incidentally. One Judy here, a Val there, a zero that strayed too close in a turning fight. By 0830, confirmed shoot-downs numbered in the double digits. The Japanese pilots, accustomed to facing more cautious defense from small carrier air groups, were astonished at the persistence of the Americans. More than once they dove toward a target only to find themselves bracketed by tracers from Wildcats coming in from opposite quarters, forcing them to jettison ordnance and break away. On St. Lo, Lieutenant Harold Bubba Thomas landed his Avenger from a torpedo run, his crew bailing out as deck crews swarmed to rearm and refuel. Even before his plane was secured, another deck crew was spotting an FM-2 for launch, a seamless handoff that kept the combat air patrol constant overhead. The carriers could ill afford to keep fighters on deck. Every landing and launch cycle was compressed to bare minutes. In one notable engagement, Lieutenant Ralph "Doc" Daves, who earlier had scattered a formation of Vals, found himself alone at low altitude with 3 Zeros angling to bracket him. He hauled the Wildcat into a climbing turn, forcing 1 Zero into a vertical overshoot. The moment the Japanese pilot slid ahead in view, Daves fired, his tracers walking up the fuselage and shredding the cockpit. The plane burst into flame and fell away. The other two pressed in, but Daves chopped throttle, dropped flaps, and turned inside their arcs, forcing them to overshoot in turn. One broke off entirely. The other he damaged enough to send trailing smoke toward the west. By mid-morning, the Wildcats had downed over 20 enemy aircraft, and still they kept flying. Damage and fuel exhaustion were constant threats. More than one pilot ditched in the sea near the formation, their comrades circling until a destroyer escort could haul them aboard. The Japanese pilots were not the only ones shocked by the tenacity of this defense. On Yamato's bridge, reports came in from cruiser captains complaining that their planned air cover had been decimated or driven off, leaving them more vulnerable to American air harassment. It was not air supremacy in the grand strategic sense. There were no massive sweeps clearing the skies for carrier strikes. But within the narrow, embattled patch of ocean that Taffy 3 occupied, the Wildcats ruled. They could not prevent every bomb or torpedo run, but they could keep the pressure high enough that no Japanese attack developed to its full potential. Each intercepted bomber meant one less danger to the carriers. Each Zero forced to break away was one less escort for the attackers still pressing in. The phrase 30 aircraft would later become shorthand for their achievement that day. The estimated number of Japanese planes downed by the FM-2s during the battle off Samar. But for the men in those cockpits, there was no tally in the moment. There was only the next contact call, the next set of bearings from the carrier's CIC, the next flicker of sunlight on a wingtip that meant another fight was coming. By the time the aerial combat reached its height, the destroyer's early charges had forced the Japanese surface line into disarray. Kurita's timetable was fraying, and his fleet was under constant harassment from both surface and air. And still, above the rolling banks of smoke and the flashing arcs of anti-aircraft tracers, the Wildcats wheeled and dove, turning a desperate retreat into an aerial brawl the Japanese had not planned for and could not quickly overcome. By late morning, the furious exchanges in both sea and sky had transformed what Kurita had envisioned as a rapid annihilation into something far more chaotic and unsettling. From the bridge of Yamato, the admiral could see the results of more than 2 hours of relentless American resistance. Smoke still curling from the damaged cruiser Kumano, another cruiser, Chikuma, falling behind with her stern low in the water, destroyers weaving in unnatural patterns as they tried to maintain station under constant air attack. And beyond them, the enemy carriers, small, slow, and seemingly fragile, were still there, retreating eastward but not succumbing. Kurita's staff officers brought reports in quick succession, their tone more strained with each one. A heavy cruiser had lost her bow and was out of the line. Multiple destroyers were reporting critical damage from torpedoes and bombs. Haruna had been forced to take evasive action twice to avoid incoming spreads, throwing off the fire solutions for the battleships astern. Ammunition expenditure was mounting quickly, and the gunnery logs showed fewer hits than expected for the volume of fire poured out since first contact. It was not only the physical damage that weighed on Kurita's mind, but the nature of the opposition. This was no timid escort group fleeing blindly for safety. The destroyers had charged headlong into his battle line, torpedoes in the water before his big guns could crush them. The aircraft had swarmed ceaselessly, striking in waves, often without the heavy ordnance one would expect for ship killing. Yet each attack disrupted, slowed, and forced his ships to maneuver. Even now, the hum of incoming radio intercepts from Japanese scouts and shore stations suggested that the Americans were coordinating far more closely than he had been led to believe. The confusion was compounded by the fog of war. Earlier that morning, Kurita's forces had been attacked in the Sibuyan Sea by waves of carrier aircraft so numerous and heavy-hitting that Musashi had been sunk under the weight of bombs and torpedoes. Now, as he faced these determined light carriers, there was a gnawing possibility. Were these truly just jeep carriers and their screens, or were they the vanguard of a much larger U.S. carrier force? The ferocity of the defense, the volume of air attack, and the sheer audacity of the destroyer assaults all hinted at a strength greater than what his reconnaissance had indicated. By 0920, the battle had reached a strange equilibrium. The range between the center force and the retreating carriers fluctuated as the Americans zigzagged and laid down smoke, while Japanese ships lost ground when forced to turn away from torpedo attacks. Wildcats and Avengers continued to strike, their presence a constant irritant that denied Kurita's ships the ability to settle into their optimum gunnery patterns. Meanwhile, the steady reports of casualties and material loss were having an effect not only on Kurita, but on the morale of his captains. Some had begun maneuvering independently to avoid perceived threats, further fraying the cohesion of the formation. On Yamato's flag bridge, the senior staff debated the merits of pressing on versus breaking off. The original objective, to break into Leyte Gulf and destroy the American transports, still lay tens of miles ahead. Every mile covered now came at a cost in damaged ships, depleted ammunition, and eroded formation discipline. If, as some feared, a major American carrier group lay just beyond the horizon, closing the trap, the center force could find itself under the kind of sustained air assault that had annihilated the carrier force at the Battle of the Philippine Sea only months before. Kurita himself was no stranger to loss. In the previous day's action, he had already seen Musashi go down, and he knew the operational truth. The Imperial Japanese Navy could not replace the capital ships and trained crews he still commanded. A decisive victory in Leyte Gulf could be worth such losses, but only if it could be achieved without walking blindly into a larger disaster. The Americans' unexpected ferocity, coupled with the absence of the kind of intelligence updates he needed, made the calculus increasingly difficult. By 0945, a particularly sharp series of air attacks forced another course change. Chikuma, now lagging well astern and under renewed assault, was fighting for survival. Suzuya, another cruiser, reported severe fires from near misses and strafing runs that had detonated ready ammunition. Kurita ordered elements of his force to detach and assist, further diluting the punch of his advance. From the perspective of the American carriers, each such moment was a gift of survival. From Kurita's, it was an erosion of the decisive, concentrated blow that Shogo 1 demanded. The hesitation did not come as a single dramatic decision. It began as a creeping doubt, a slowing of pace here, a diversion of strength there. But as the clock ticked toward midday, the cumulative effect of Taffy 3's resistance, the destroyer's torpedo runs, and the ceaseless air harassment was bending the course of the battle. The Japanese center force was still immensely powerful, still capable of inflicting terrible destruction. Yet its admiral was now weighing the possibility that this fight was not the one he had set out to win. Above and around the retreating Americans, the Wildcats still circled, ready to dive on any bomber or torpedo plane that broke through. In the cluttered sea ahead, the surviving destroyers maneuvered doggedly, laying smoke and firing at the lead elements of the Japanese line. Kurita's next decision would determine whether Samar became a killing ground for the Americans, or the moment when the last great surface strike of the Imperial Japanese Navy began to falter under the weight of resistance it had not anticipated. As the surface fight churned on below, the aerial battle above Samar began to take on a rhythm of its own. Not the ordered cadence of a well-planned combat air patrol, but the chaotic, relentless pulse of pilots launching, fighting, rearming, and launching again with barely a pause to draw breath. The FM-2 Wildcats from VC-3 aboard Kalinin Bay, VC-5 from Kitkun Bay, and VC-10 from Gambier Bay had been aloft since the first moments of the morning's alarm, and by late morning their role had shifted from desperate harassment to something more decisive: the systematic breaking of every Japanese air attack that tried to reach the carriers. The circumstances were unlike any textbook air battle. Communication was patchy. More than once, returning pilots would land to find that no one on their home carrier knew exactly where they had been fighting or against how many enemies. Fuel states dictated tactics. Many Wildcats were flying without wingmen, forced into single aircraft scrambles the moment they were spotted and fueled, climbing into battle alone. And yet, this piecemeal, frantic deployment worked in the defenders' favor. The Japanese never faced a fixed, predictable fighter screen. Instead, every approach route toward Taffy 3 seemed to produce another Wildcat, materializing low over the waves or dropping out of cloud to tear into their formations. Shortly after 10 o'clock, a dozen Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers approached from the west, intending to strike the carriers still within range of Kurita's heavy guns. They had no fighter escort. The Zeros that should have been with them were already tied up fending off earlier intercepts. Lieutenant J.G. Harold C. Knudsen of VC-5, flying without a wingman, rolled in from 5,000 feet, firing long bursts that set one Val ablaze before it even began its dive. Pulling hard into the others, he forced them to scatter, spoiling their attack runs. 2 more were destroyed before the survivors jettisoned their bombs and fled north, streaming smoke. In post-war accounts, Japanese survivors admitted the shock they felt encountering such tenacity from aircraft they considered obsolescent. Ensign Masao Yamashita, who flew Zeros over Samar, recalled, "We expected the Americans to be on the defensive, to protect their ships and avoid waste. Instead, they hunted us." These small fighters would turn inside our Zeros at low speed, and the pilots fired with great accuracy. Many of our best were lost because we underestimated them. The FM-2's strengths were perfectly matched to Samar's conditions. At low and medium altitudes, its lighter airframe and improved engine climb performance gave it a sharper rate of turn than the heavier F-6F Hellcat, and critically, better sustained agility than the Zero below 200 knots. Its rugged construction absorbed punishment. Wildcats returned with holes in wings, oil streaming from damaged engines, and still landed safely on decks barely long enough to catch a wire. This survivability allowed pilots to push deeper into attacks, making head-on passes that would have been suicidal in a flimsier fighter. By midday, the running tally, informal, scrawled in grease pencil on ready room boards, was already astonishing. Pilots from VC-3 claimed 8 confirmed kills, VC-5 another 9, and VC-10 was in double digits. In most cases, these victories were the direct result of breaking up coordinated attacks on the carriers. Even when a Japanese plane wasn't shot down, if it was forced to break away, jettison its ordnance, or lose formation cohesion, it counted as a defensive success. Lieutenant Ralph "Doc" Daves of VC-10, already with several kills that morning, tangled with a formation of Yokosuka D-4Y Judy bombers attempting a high-speed approach from cloud cover. Diving from above and behind, Daves flamed one Judy on the first pass, then rolled under the formation and came up firing into the belly of another. He took return fire. One round shattered his port aileron control, but kept flying, circling back to make a third pass that sent a third Judy spiraling into the sea. Unable to maneuver freely, he still managed to limp back to Gambier Bay's deck, his kill markings now nearly filling the space under his cockpit. Japanese pilots grew wary of the escort carrier's air groups. One Zero pilot, interviewed years later, said, "We thought the small carriers had little to fight with, but they never stopped attacking. It was like fighting hornets that came from every cloud and wave." That psychological effect was as important as the physical losses inflicted. Each wave of attackers hesitated longer, altered course wider, and approached at altitudes and angles less favorable for accurate strikes, all of which made the carrier's evasive maneuvers and flak more effective. The attrition was steep. By the time Kurita began to consider withdrawing, post-action analysis would show that approximately 30 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed by Wildcats alone during the battle, a figure unprecedented for escort carrier air groups operating in a purely defensive role. Many of these kills were one-on-one engagements fought under fuel and ammunition limits, in which the American pilot had to break off after a single firing pass to race back for more fuel. The human cost to the defenders was not absent. Several Wildcats were lost outright, some to enemy fire, others to fuel exhaustion and ditching. Pilots bailed out into the oily sea, where destroyer escorts fished them from the water between shell splashes. Yet the losses were sustainable compared to the damage they were preventing. Every Japanese bomber destroyed in the air was one less that could join the pounding already being delivered by Kurita's battleships and cruisers. As the afternoon wore on, the nature of the air battle changed subtly. Fewer enemy aircraft appeared over the horizon. Those that did were often singletons or pairs, probing for an opening rather than pressing home in large formations. The Wildcats still went up to meet them, but now the intercepts were often over empty ocean, with the Japanese turning away before contact. The once continuous drone of inbound attack reports over the carrier's radios began to fade. This was not the result of a single decisive aerial action, but the cumulative effect of hours of relentless piecemeal combat. A fight in which individual pilots and tiny sections, often without mutual support, had cut down wave after wave until the attacking force was simply spent. For Kurita, already wrestling with damage to his own fleet and the gnawing fear of American reinforcements, the loss of this promised air support further eroded any confidence in pressing into Leyte Gulf. When the Wildcats finally stood down, late in the day, their decks bore the scars of the fight. Bullet-riddled wings, landing gear struts bent from hard traps, engines caked with oil and exhaust residue. In the ready rooms, pilots slumped in their seats, faces streaked with sweat and grime, the sound of the last strafing runs still ringing in their ears. 30 enemy aircraft had been confirmed destroyed, a number few could believe until the tallies were verified against other squadrons' claims and Japanese records. For a group that had begun the day expecting routine patrol duty, it was a feat that would enter the lore of naval aviation. The Japanese, too, would remember. In after-action reports and later memoirs, their pilots admitted to underestimating the escort carrier's air groups, a mistake they would not have the chance to correct. In the microcosm of the Samar battlefield, the FM-2 Wildcat had achieved what every defending fighter dreams of, not just surviving against superior numbers, but turning the enemy back in the air, robbing them of their sting, and helping to change the course of the fight below. By early afternoon, the tempo of gunfire and air attacks slackened, replaced by the low thrum of the carrier's engines and the intermittent crackle of radios relaying damage reports. Just before midday, Vice Admiral Kurita had issued the order to reverse course and withdraw his center force. No grand announcement marked the moment. The Japanese ships simply began to turn, their wakes curling away toward the northwest. For the men of Taffy 3, the change was at first hard to believe. Many could not see the enemy's turn through the thick smoke that still hung over the sea. But as the minutes passed without another full salvo of armor-piercing shells crashing among them, the truth settled in. The enemy was leaving. The reprieve did not erase the cost. The destroyer USS Johnston, which had charged first into the Japanese line, was gone. Her survivors, scattered in life rafts and clinging to debris, recalled her final moments, decks awash, guns still firing as long as they bore on a target. Commander Evans last seen on the fantail, giving orders as the sea closed over the stern. USS Howell lay on the bottom, her crew likewise adrift in the oil-slicked water after withstanding more than 40 major-caliber hits. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, had been smashed and sunk after a gun duel with a heavy cruiser, her surviving crew huddled together in small groups awaiting rescue. For those still aboard the surviving carriers and escorts, the transition from chaos to quiet was almost disorienting. The hours of constant maneuvering, the roar of aircraft launches, the concussion of near misses, and the ceaseless chatter over radios had been replaced by an uneasy stillness. Flight deck crews stood among the pocked and scarred planks, the smell of cordite and aviation fuel still hanging in the humid air. In the ready rooms, pilots sat slumped in their chairs, faces streaked with salt and sweat, the adrenaline of the fight giving way to exhaustion. Rescue work began immediately. Destroyer escorts weaved back through the battleground, lowering boats and hauling oil-slicked, salt-stung men from the sea. Some survivors had been in the water for hours, eyes stinging from fuel, skin blistered by sun. From the bridge of Hirman, Captain Hathaway described the strange, somber satisfaction of seeing battered, half-decked life rafts filled with men from Johnston or Roberts come alongside. "We had beaten the odds," he later said, but at a price that would never be forgotten by any man there. The scale of the Japanese losses was slower to tally, but they were significant, and, in some respects, more irreplaceable than the damage to their ships. Kumano was crippled and would take no further meaningful part in the war. Chikuma and Chokai would be lost later that day to aircraft from other American forces. Haruna and other battleships had been forced to evade multiple torpedo attacks and were delayed, their operational rhythm broken. Perhaps most telling was the depletion of their air component. The 30 aircraft brought down by Wildcats alone represented not just hardware, but trained aviators Japan could no longer afford to lose. By October 1944, the pipeline for pilot training was producing crews with fewer hours and less combat seasoning, a decline that battles like Samar only accelerated. In the immediate aftermath, U.S. commanders took careful note of what had happened off Samar. The escort carriers, intended primarily for convoy work and close ground support, had survived an encounter with one of the most powerful surface fleets ever assembled, largely because of aggressive tactics, the coordination of surface and air attacks, and the determination of their air groups. The FM-2 Wildcats, far from obsolete, had proven ideally suited to the kind of knife-fight defense that the day demanded. The kill tally from VC-3, VC-5, and VC-10 became a point of immense pride, not just within those squadrons, but across the Navy's aviation community. In after-action reviews, the phrase, 30 enemy aircraft destroyed, appeared alongside citations for extraordinary heroism. Pilots who had flown without wingmen, taking on whole formations to break their attack runs, were recommended for decorations. Survivors of the destroyers received their own honors. Commander Evans of Johnston would be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The synergy between the tin cans and the Wildcats became a textbook example of joint defense against a superior force. For the Japanese Navy, Samar marked the last time a major surface force would threaten an American invasion fleet. Kurita's withdrawal, though debated in Tokyo, spared what remained of his battleships and heavy cruisers from destruction, but at the cost of conceding the Philippines and the strategic initiative. The aircraft lost over Samar were never replaced in kind. The men who had flown them, many veterans of earlier campaigns, were gone. In the long shadow of the war, the battle off Samar entered naval history less as a conventional victory than as a tale of defiance, of a thin shield that held when it should have shattered. For the men who flew the Wildcats that day, the memory was personal. Each kill not just a number, but a bomber that never released its load, a torpedo plane that never leveled out for a strike, a fighter that never raked a carrier's deck. Those 30 kills became more than a statistic. They were 30 threats removed from a sky already thick with danger, 30 moments when a pilot's decision to press in, to fire, to turn inside an attacker made the difference between survival and loss for the ships below. When the guns finally fell silent and the sea off Samar was left to the drifting wreckage, the battered survivors of Taffy 3 knew they had faced a force that, on paper, should have overwhelmed them in minutes. They also knew that without the Wildcats' shield above and the destroyer's charge ahead, there would have been no carriers left to save. In the reckoning of that day, courage, coordination, and sheer refusal to yield had carried the balance and etched the name of Samar into the annals of naval legend. In the years that followed, the morning off Samar on 25 October 1944 came to stand as one of the most improbable episodes in naval history, an engagement in which a small, lightly armed escort carrier group faced, fought, and turned back one of the last great surface fleets of the Imperial Japanese Navy. For the sailors and airmen of Taffy 3, the day became a touchstone of memory, a measure of what could be endured and achieved against overwhelming odds. For historians and naval strategists, it became a case study in the interplay of courage, improvisation, and the hard geometry of war at sea. In operational terms, Samar was a defensive victory that carried far-reaching consequences. Kurita's withdrawal meant that the American landings on Leyte remained secure. The Japanese plan under Shogo I to converge on the invasion fleet from north and south, trapping and annihilating it, had failed. The southern force had been destroyed in Surigao Strait. The decoy northern force had been mauled off Cape Engano. With the center force now turned back, the Philippines were effectively lost to the empire. In the months that followed, Japan's oil supply from the southern territories dwindled to a trickle, crippling fleet operations and accelerating the collapse of its war effort. But Samar's legacy was not written only in terms of strategic movement and territorial control. The battle reshaped perceptions of the ships and weapons involved. The escort carriers, long seen as second-line assets, proved their worth as resilient platforms capable of sustaining air operations under extreme pressure. Their composite air groups, with FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers, demonstrated that even light aviation could blunt a superior surface fleet when wielded aggressively and in concert with surface ships. In post-war doctrinal debates, Samar was often cited as evidence that distributed, smaller carrier groups could deliver disproportionate defensive value in contested waters. The destroyers and destroyer escorts, the tin cans, became the battle's enduring heroes. USS Johnston, Howell, and Samuel B. Roberts entered naval lore not merely for their loss, but for the manner in which they were lost, charging battleships, launching torpedoes under heavy fire, shielding the carriers until they could escape. Their crew's actions were recognized with some of the Navy's highest honors, and their names would be spoken alongside earlier ships that had faced hopeless odds with defiance. Above all, the battle cemented the reputation of the FM-2 Wildcat squadrons of VC-3, VC-5, and VC-10. Against expectations, these aircraft, slower, less heavily armed, and often flying without wingmen due to the chaos, had accounted for roughly 30 confirmed aerial victories in a single day. Post-war analyses in both American and Japanese records confirmed the impact. The loss of those aircraft denied Kurita's fleet the coordinated air cover and strike capability that might have tipped the balance at critical moments. The Wildcats' performance at Samar became a staple of naval aviation training, an example of how understanding one's aircraft, seizing the tactical advantages of environment and maneuver, and pressing the attack could yield results out of proportion to numbers. For the Japanese Navy, Samar was a bitter lesson in the cost of underestimating an opponent. Pilots interviewed after the war spoke candidly of their surprise at the aggressiveness of the escort carrier air groups. Many had expected to find poorly trained crews flying outdated planes, easy to brush aside on the way to the carriers themselves. Instead, they met pilots who turned head-on into attacks, who fought at the limits of their endurance, and who seemed to appear in every quadrant of the sky. The attrition suffered in these air duels was compounded by the already irreplaceable losses Japan had endured in the Marianas and the Philippine Sea. Samar accelerated that decline, leaving the Imperial Navy's air arm hollow in the final months of the war. The human legacy was perhaps the most profound. Survivors of Taffy 3 gathered in the decades after the war, their reunions a blend of grief and pride. They spoke of shipmates lost, of Evans on Johnston, Kintberger on Howell, Copeland on Samuel B. Roberts, and of the young aviators who had not returned from their last sorties. They also spoke of the strange clarity that had gripped them that morning, that survival depended not on outgunning the enemy, but on unsettling him, on attacking so persistently and from so many directions that his confidence faltered. The battle's place in public memory was secured by the accounts that emerged soon after the war. Samuel Eliot Morison, the Navy's official historian, devoted a chapter to Samar in his multi-volume history of U.S. naval operations, calling it the most remarkable of all actions in the Pacific War. Decades later, books and documentaries would retell the story, often emphasizing the disparity in forces and the sheer audacity of the American defense. In those retellings, the Wildcats' 30 kills became a symbolic shorthand for the entire day, proof that skill and resolve could blunt the edge of overwhelming power. In the annals of naval doctrine, Samar is often invoked alongside Midway, Surigao Strait, and other moments when the dynamics of the fight overturned the assumptions of planners. For carrier operations in particular, it underscored the enduring need for aggressive air defense, even from units not intended for frontline fleet combat. The escort carrier's ability to launch continuous sorties under fire, to use every aircraft regardless of ideal armament, and to integrate with surface action in real time, became a case study in adaptability. And yet, the legacy is not without its note of loss. The calm that settled over the sea after Kurita's withdrawal was deceptive. Beneath it lay hundreds of men missing or dead, their ships lying in pieces on the seabed. For those who fought there, the pride in what they achieved was inseparable from the memory of the cost. Many who survived carried a sense of unfinished duty, to remember the ones who did not, and to ensure the story of Samar was told with both its triumph and its tragedy intact. In the final reckoning, the battle off Samar stood as both a last gasp and a lasting symbol. For Japan, it marked the end of any realistic hope of decisive surface action. For the United States, it reaffirmed that naval warfare was as much a contest of will and ingenuity as of tonnage and firepower. And for the men of Taffy 3, it became the defining chapter of their service, a day when a thin shield of small ships, stubby fighters, and determined crews turned back a storm, and in doing so secured their place in history.